All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and keep everybody muted. If anybody has any questions or comments, please do throw them in the chat box. Looks like there's a few people still trickling in. I think we've got about 15 people here, about half or so what I was expecting. So we'll give it a couple more minutes. If somebody would just give me a quick thumbs up in the chat box, just to make sure that one, you can both hear me, and then two, also you can see my screen where you should see half of a reviewer, and then the other half is kind of a high level deck. Great, good, thank you. So we have a couple more minutes here. All right, that's good. Why don't we go ahead and get started? I am going to go ahead and record this. So for anybody who obviously wasn't able to make it, or anybody from your teams that couldn't attend, I can share that back out to people, and feel free to share that with whoever they want. So we do a lot of these I guess we'll call them hybrid webinars, where it's either we have guests on here, we talk through their programming, or it's me solo, kind of just talking through things that we're seeing in the industry and kind of best practices when it comes to different elements of managing parts of awards, grants, scholarships, fellowships, conference call for entries, and the many nuances that make up these programs. So today's conversation is going to revolve around kind of some of the best practices and things that come into the reviewing side of things. So as a committee member, sitting down and actually conducting reviews of scholarship or grant or whatever it might be applicants. And so when we had sent out the initial invite, we also added a little note that asked, if people had any certain topics they wanted to cover, and a large number of people wanted to actually kind of see how that portion of these programs is powered within Reviewer. And so I think we'll kind of do a side by side, a little bit different than what I had planned on doing, where we kind of walk through some of the best practices when reviewing applicants and how that translate into Reviewer. And that kind of leads us into our introduction of where Reviewer came from, because I think it's an important conversation to talk through, because really the entire platform and Reviewer was built off of best practices. So we didn't just sit here and build a software or a tool to power these programs, with a bunch of features that we think you might want. It was actually people like yourselves, as well as us now doing this for over a decade, who have real life experience, boots on the ground, running these programs. And so we try to kind of adapt our platform and work with you guys to mesh and work with your existing processes, and kind of customize it to the extent possible. But at the same time, all the tools that we built in place are there for a reason, because we truly feel like the way that we have things set up, it really is kind of the best practices. So we're going to cover a couple high level topics today. One of the most popular things we often hear is, how do you go about assigning applicants or applications to your review committees? Should you guys do it randomly? Do you assign them manually? What happens if you have way more submissions than review members? Do you have to recruit more of them? So we're going to kind of talk through probably the 3 or 4 different high level examples and options that we see quite a bit of, and then how those processes work within Reviewer. We actually have a pretty cool feature set when it comes to assigning submissions to committees. 2, we'll kind of talk a little about the data itself. So as the review team comes in, what are they actually seeing? What data should be blinded if you're going to do it? Where should you focus on blinding data? What do you do about data that can't be blinded? So for example, personal content within file uploads. How do we make the review team's life extremely simple? So when it comes to like document sharing, how do we keep them into one centralized place? And then the last item we're going to talk about is the actual review process itself. And so that's kind of a fun conversation, because obviously Reviewer is very scorecard centric. It comes to a lot of our compliance background. But at the end of the day, scores don't always tell the whole story. And so how do we kind of leverage the data and leverage what's going on to have like deliberation meetings with the committees to help kind of justify the results? So with that said, we'll kind of jump into things. So I talked a little bit about our background and really why we built Reviewer, and it kind of from a compliance perspective. So at a really high level, we've been around since about 2012. It's hard to believe it's been almost a full decade of doing this, but here we are. And we did so from our own personal experience. So our team kind of comes from both an applicant side of things, and specifically funding opportunities, and then as well as part of the review committees. So back in 2012, tools like Reviewer didn't exist. And so if you think through like a scholarship program or a grant, and you're part of a review committee, you didn't have these fancy tools to log into to conduct the reviews. You were going through binders. So you'd have one binder per applicant. Each binder would have, 15 to 20 pages in it. And it was up to us to kind of handwrite in notes and feedback and thoughts. A lot of times we fill out score sheets that were on Excel spreadsheets. And then we'd either physically mail it back in, or there'd be like an in-person deliberation meeting on a weekend. And we would talk with the other committee members and kind of narrow down the results. On the other side of things, as an applicant, we did that as well. So we were the ones who were going to the websites, downloading the fillable PDFs, sending in the emails with a bunch of attachments, and applying. And so where the two worlds met was on the applicant side of things, where if we weren't selected for a funding opportunity, our frustration lied with why, right? So a lot of the value proposition you guys provide to these isn't just the money being given out or the awards or the grants or the selections. It's also potentially all the people who don't get selected. Why was that? How can we help improve? I always like to kind of think back to like back in, college days. If you're applying for a college application to go to school and you weren't accepted, you typically just told you weren't accepted, right? It's quite frustrating because you want to know why you weren't accepted. And so how do we kind of take that review process and translate that more back into like a feedback mechanism for the applicants? Long-winded answer, that's also where from the review side of things we came into play, because believe it or not, back in 2012, we were writing pen on paper feedback on those binders of why we reviewed the applicants in a way that we did, with the goal of giving it back to them. But because it wasn't quite possible, that never happened. So that's kind of the angle we came from. Ultimately, we've kind of three main goals. Number one is time. So from an admin perspective, or even like a review team perspective, there's only so many hours in a day. You guys have a lot of busy things going on. You're wearing a lot of different hats. So if we can help you spend less time in spreadsheets and less time sending emails and more time focusing on your mission, that's a major win. Number two is the overarching experience. So we've kind of grown into this technology platform where things become very transactional. People log in, people submit, people receive, but these are at the end of the day our experiences. How do we leave them with a good, lasting impression? So from an applicant's perspective, how do we allow them to focus on the writing of their content and less so about did you receive it or did it get lost when internet connection might have left? From a review team's perspective, since they are oftentimes volunteers, how do we kind of dumb down their work to 2 to 3 hours versus 7 to 8 hours, or oftentimes much, much more? And then the third thing is a compliance perspective. Now, this wasn't a use case within Reviewer, but it really kind of comes to the core of why we exist. And so here's a quick little story. As part of a scholarship program, there was an organization where these scholarship applicants would either fill out a form or they would write it in Word. And then they would send an email to the scholarship maker with a bunch of attachments for their scholarship. So that happened. And at one time, the review committee got together and they went through a bunch of scholarship applications that were obviously printed off and exported and compiled, and they made decisions. Fast forwarding multiple months, it was found out that there was a handful of scholarship applicants who were sitting in a spam filter. So when that review team sat down and make their decisions, there were applicants who never even got reviewed. So one, that review team's time was not only wasted, but two, it's incredibly frustrating because at the end of the day, there's a lot of really important things that are happening. So that kind of brings us back into reviewer and why we exist. It's the compliance side of things. So if somebody is applying to your program, be that an award, grant, scholarship, fellowship, competition, we don't care. They know that as soon as they press that submit button, overarching, here's what that process is going to look like. And if you guys decide to do so, at the very end of the day, you can confirm that, yes, the application came in, it went through the entire process, they did get evaluated, we have all the notes, we have all the communication, and really helps not only give them the experience, but also protects you guys from things like audits. So we'll jump into some of the reviewer items. And, again, in the chat bot, if anybody has any stories or anything like that are unique processes you want to kind of cover as well, please do throw them on there. Because while you might think it's unique, it probably isn't. So a lot of times your processes would be relevant to everybody else in the call. So when it comes to taking your scholarship, grant, or whatever it might be, applications, and then assigning them to review teams, we kind of see three main things. So I'm going to hop over to what we call in Reviewer is our buckets. And so for us, this is really where everything starts. This is where the pairings of applicants and committees or teams comes into play. So there's a lot of ways that we see this done. Number one is the most simple process, right? You have a team of review members who looks at every single scholarship or grant or award or fellowship applicant. It's simple, right? Because they come in, they all go out. The downside to that, however, though, is what happens if you start to get large volume. And so can you really expect, a review team member to review 15, 20, 30, 40 submissions? If that is the case, how to be sensitive to their time? The other drawback to that is sometimes you might have a program where it requires a certain set of experts. So how do you make sure that the right people are actually reviewing the right submission? So we'll kind of just cover that first simple option, right? Which is basically all submissions go to all team members. So here we are in Reviewer. I always describe this section as a bucketing system, and it's a super simple layout, but it's incredibly powerful. And at its core, basically you take a bucket and you fill it up with a bunch of applicants, and then you fill it up with a bunch of committee members. When the committee comes in, boom, they can see all of the applicants that were given to them within their bucket. So if it's more of the simple process where every applicant is reviewed by every committee member, it's as simple as adding a group and calling it, let's just say, for example, review group. You would then assign all of your submissions to the review group. And then if you open it up, you'll then notice that you can then assign all of your review staff to it. So review staff comes in, boom, they can review all the applications. Now, once they've been added, it does give you the option to have some manual controls. So for example, what happens if there's a conflict of interest, or as you guys are, I'm sure, are aware, a review committee member decides to kind of go on vacation or drop out at the very last minute? How do you reassign them? So in this interface, it shows you two different tabs. One is a listing of all of your applicants, and then the other is a listing of all of the review committee members. So in that use case, let's say, for example, here that Judge Judy decided to go on vacation, I can actually grab her name from this list. And again, she's reviewing all the scholarship applicants in this use case. What I can do is I can actually then unassign from her name and then reassign them back out. So even though you have at a high level all the applicants being reviewed by everybody, it does give you some further control. The second most popular workflow that we see, or probably the most popular workflow, but the second option we see here is based off of these buckets. So common use cases consist of things like multiple categories. It could be multiple phases of review. It could be location-based, or it could be a combination of all of them. So let's kind of put ourselves back in the scholarship world. As you guys can probably imagine, I've had a lot of calls today with people doing scholarships. That's top of mind. But if you are an organization that gives out 10 different scholarships, or maybe you give out 10 different grants, a really common workflow is, as an applicant, when I'm filling out my profile, I may select from a dropdown or some type of choice that says I'm applying for the Merlin scholarship. And then as soon as I submit, it puts me into a bucket with all of the other Merlin scholarship applicants. So at the end of the day, you have all these buckets that are broken out by the type of application, and then only the relevant submitters are in their bucket. So what you can do at that point is actually give out those buckets to your review teams, almost like a committee. So for example, if the Frederickson Foundation is as a donor to the Merlin Award, I would only be in that scholarship, whereas maybe the Johnson family is a funder to the Michelin Star scholarship. So when they log in, only they should see applicants in their group. Other use cases consist of like categories. So if it's like a grant program, maybe there's like 5 different grant types, very similar. You might even have different grant committees who are in charge of their specific grants. What you can do also there is have different start and end dates, or even different phases. So to kind of layer on top of that, maybe you have these different grant categories, but there's also 3 phases of review, right? There's a phase 1 where people kind of come in, log in, review them. You narrow it down to the top 20, then advance them on to the third phase. That's where this division tab comes into place. Again, some of those more advanced controls, which we're going to look at now, still come into play, because what happens if you have a bucket, but within your bucket, you don't want all of the review committee members to look at all of the entries? Again, conflicts of interest, or what happens if there's just too many? So let's use that use case here, because again, this is probably the most common way that reviewer is used, as well as the most powerful. So as it stands, we have the Merlin Award, and we're going to make the assumption that all of our applicants to the Merlin Award are in that bucket. If I come over, we also have a team. So whenever these review committee members, and I can actually assign them here, so I can add as many committee members as I want to that category. But whenever they log into their account, they're going to see all of the submissions to the Merlin Award. We also have here a third layer, which is a judge manager. So maybe that's like the committee chair. So that person is actually in charge of tracking down the results. They're in charge of managing the judges or review members within that bucket. So at its core, great. When they log in, they see all the Merlin Awards. What happens if there's 300 submissions? Do we really expect all of these applicants or review members to review all 300 of them? So what's going to end up happening here is if I click manage assignments, there's that split screen again. So number one is it shows me all of my applicants to that bucket. Number two is my committee members. So we can get kind of creative here. We can go back to my submission side of things and say, you know what, for the sake of fairness, I'm going to automatically assign randomly each applicant 10 review members. So whenever they log into their account, they're going to get 10 eyes on their profile. Or you can do vice versa or a combination of both and say, you know what, for the sake of time, my review team can't look at all of them. I only want them to look at 3. So I can click auto assign, say each one gets, maybe no more than 4, but no less than 2. And then the system will randomly give each committee member that many entries. So we kind of took it from the overarching bucket level. It said, hey, every review member reviews everybody, down to this really manual process. So that's one way of doing things. Once you do those auto pairings, what you can also do then is start to modify them. So great, we did our manual pairings, but here we see that Barbara maybe wants to do 3 more of them. So then you can jump in here and do manual, and then give Barbara 3 more, set the assignments, and boom, now Barbara has 4. So kind of ran through at a high level how submissions are assigned out to teams and reviewer. If anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to throw them in the chat bot. While we're here, I'm going to go ahead and address the question that just came in, which is about having an application form live in reviewer, or having it link out to where it lives, or it could be in a database. So with reviewer, the idea is to use us from start to finish, right? You have applicants creating their profiles, they're doing their submission process. That's not really today's conversation, although we have a really powerful set of profiling tools when it comes to like data capture, because once they come in, that's how we do these pairings. We do, however, have a bulk upload feature though. So if you do have a bunch of submissions living in a database or in a spreadsheet or living somewhere else, you could actually upload them into Reviewer. It'll automatically create these profiles for them. The only difference is that they wouldn't have an account, although there are ways that we can get them for them. And then you can use Reviewer as intended, right? So let's pretend that we uploaded all of these applicants. Boom, once they come in, they're good to go. And we can also save you some energy too. So in that import file, we can actually include like what category or what bucket they belong to. And that way they can go in there. That's actually a super good comment because it leads to the data side of things, because the next piece of this is kind of blinding data, which we've seen pop up here quite a bit in the last couple months from a compliance perspective, specifically in funding opportunities. When the review committee comes in, they really shouldn't be able to see any information about who the applicants are, and vice versa. If you guys are doing some type of feedback sharing, so once the reviews are done, maybe you want the applicants to come back in and see how they were scored or see their comments, but you don't want to see who left the comments. Or maybe you don't want them to see the scores, you want them just to see the comments. So things like that. So if you were to do an import file with your data, Carrie, that's great. You can either decide not to import the blinded data, or you can still blind it later on. So we're going to jump into my submission listing. And so in Reviewer, as people submit and create these profiles, they fall into this list. You can sort and filter by all the different parameters. You can have your dropdowns, you can search by categories. But ultimately, once you click view, it opens their profile. And this is kind of the beauty and bread and butter of Reviewer, is that we're not just your online forms, and we're not just like a random data collection. We're very profile centric. So the goal here is the applicant's profile holds onto all the information about them, holds onto all the file uploads, holds onto all the results, it holds onto potentially some of the note taking and communication as well. And then bigger picture, what happens if you're doing a grant and in 8 months you want a applicant to log back in and submit a post-grant follow-up or a post-grant deliverable. So being able to accompany all those types of things in here. With that said, because we are profile centric though, is it does give us really hyper control over blinding data. So kind of scrolling through here, we have 3 user types. You have an admin, an applicant, and a review team. And all 3 of them can be targeted with what data should be presented. So as we scroll through George Costanza's application here, maybe all we want the review team to look at is the nominee description. There's some short answers and essays here. Maybe all these documents we don't want them to include. Maybe all this personal information isn't relevant, and things like the Twitter profile and the LinkedIn URL. Well, it's not necessarily something we have to hide. It's not relevant to the review process. So instead of bogging the review teams down with a bunch of data that they don't need to conduct the reviews, you can actually target each of these elements and hide it from them. As I scroll through here, We also have a file upload section. And so we can actually decide to hide all the files from the applicant's point of view and or the review team's point of view. I do want to note though that there is no way to hide or blind the data within a file. So a lot of times, say for example, if I click view here, it will preview this feature as well. The reference letter. So as you can see, reviewer has an embedded document viewer. So I don't actually have to download anything. It all shows up in our system. But let's say, for example, somewhere in this reference was a name or personal information. What you guys can very easily do as admins is you can download it and then instantly click upload and re-add it back in there after you kind of draw through it or line through it. We also have a line note-taking tool here. So I can maybe scratch some things off, export things and re-upload them back in. So you can get kind of creative with how we do that. The other thing I want to point out is the content in the form. So while we can target George's first name here, or we can target his last name, what we can't do is pull out George Costanza in this open-ended text field. So again, as admins, we make things super simple for you. You can either decide to blind that whole section from the committee's view, or as you can see here, I actually have an edit button. So we have a client, I'm not sure if I can use names. It's a healthcare organization that does a large award program that would actually come in here and they'll type in redacted, right? So you can, as you're reviewing these information, and then you can come back in here and click save. And then boom, that data is now blinded. The other element that I want to look at here then is the evaluations. So when it comes to scoring, if you are doing feedback sharing, and we'll save this for another conversation, it's a polarizing topic of should you share back results with applicants. At Reviewer, we feel that for the majority of programs, it would serve you guys well. I know that a lot of times we get some pushback on that because you don't want to share back scores or feedback and you just want to make the selection and be done. We always feel that part of it might be risk because once you open those doors, it's like opening the floodgates. But that's also why we exist at Reviewer. So by ensuring that we have these fair and equitable workflows in place and we have proof of process and we do things the right way and you're protected, that by sharing that feedback, you're providing a tremendous amount of value to your users because I'm going to make up a number. If you have 100 scholarship applicants and you give out 5 scholarships, do we want to provide value to the 5 that get money, or do we want to provide value to all 100 of them, with the 95 being feedback on how they can improve moving forward? Because what happens if one of those scorecards or one of those notes that was left for them allows them to go and apply for a different scholarship and acquire funding and completely change their life, right? That's exactly why Reviewer exists. So if you are going to go down that rabbit hole and you do decide to share back feedback, now you have to decide what you want to share back. So as an applicant, if you do that, a lot of times it's done via automation. So bulk notifications can go out and say, hey, George, the results are in, log in to see your scores and feedback. When George logs in, he would actually see something very similar to this. And what you would do is in Reviewer, you'd blind all the names. So all the review members would say Reviewer 1, Reviewer 2, Reviewer 3, because you don't want your review team's names floating out there for them. And then what you can do is you can either share back everything or elements of it. So maybe you don't want to share back the scores. You want to just share back Simon Cowell's comments. You can do that. Or maybe you want to share back just the scores, but not the comments. Or maybe you want to do a combination of both. So in theory, if you are sharing back everything, though, the applicant can jump in here, click view, and then boom, there's Skyman's score sheet. So I know right away how I was scored. I know I got a score of a 70.91. I know how I was scored on every single applicant. I know all of Simon's, well, quite possibly critical comments, how they were done. Now, as admins, you guys can actually modify that content. So if you want to maybe make the comments a bit cleaner and a bit more constructive, you can definitely do things like that as well. That's one way. The other way we see this done is through the note-taking tool. So a lot of our clients might jump in here once the reviews are done, jump into the question and comment section, and start to log some communication. So George, great work. This year, though, not receiving funds. Here is why, right? Don't word things as poorly as I do. And then what happens, you can actually share back that one note to George. So again, lots of ways to share back feedback to applicants. But yeah, we just want to make sure that if you are going to go through that blinding process, that you make sure you cover everything. So as far as giving the review team access to the submissions, as well as the data that they're going to get, we're going to kind of lump these two together because kind of the final piece to this puzzle. I try to keep these to about 30 minutes or so. So we'll focus on that side of things next. So we have all of our scholarship or grant or award applications that came in. They're in the buckets. We have the committees that signed out to them. If I jump over to my review team listing, you'll also see the buckets that they've been assigned to. What we end up doing then is jumping into reviewer. And a lot of times you want to trigger this. So we have a menu system. So you basically mark them all as accepted for review, which actually enables it for the review team to begin reviewing. And then what you would do is you can jump over to the manage reviewer section. And then you have to give them account credentials. So in reviewer, there's kind of two different ways that you can give your review team access to the platform. Number one is that you can add them or import them, and then you can select them all, and then you can use our invite template. And what this is ultimately going to do is send them an email that says, "Dear George, click on this link to register." Once that happens, you can begin to track George. So you can see, did George get the email? Did they actually register? You can run these reports and see how many submissions have been assigned to George, or in this case, it'd be Barbara. What progress percent has she reviewed? How many more does she have left? Things like that. The alternative to that is if a client wants to have a bit more of a hands-on approach and maybe simplify things, instead of sending out that invite, they might do a temporary password, assign all of the review teams a password, and then use our email templates to actually notify them. And what this would say is it would say, "Dear Barbara, your username is this, your password is this, click on this link." So it's so simple that the review team can just copy and paste it into reviewer, and then boom, they're into the platform. So again, we have these buckets full of submissions. We have these buckets full of review members. Our review team has been invited. Now, when they log into their account, they are going to see something like this. And so this is the reviewing portal. And I always like to describe this as like a menu system. So when they come into their account, they're going to have some type of instructions, information from you to them, expectations, dates, deadlines. We always like to include like, how-tos of using reviewer and things like that. But ultimately, they're going to see a menu of all of the applicants you want them to look at. So again, if you think back to how this was done previously before tools like Reviewer, you'd be sending out Google Drive folders to your committee, right? One folder per applicant. You then give them a spreadsheet, and they'd have to go through every one of the folders, download the material, view them, go to the spreadsheet, log their notes in Reviewer. They get a nice simple menu. What they can do here, and again, this menu can be blinded, right? So if you want to pull back and not show the name or the dates, all you want them to see is an ID, then all of these columns can be hidden. But the thought here is incredibly simple. The review team just simply clicks on the name of the applicant or the ID, and they get a split screen. So on the left-hand side is all of the information, and then the right-hand side is the criteria. So at the end of the day, what can happen here is that it's a split scroll. So the entire profile can show up and they can toggle back and forth. So they can read through the profile, they can log their notes, log their scores, they can jump over to the attachment section, they can press view. Again, it embeds itself. So they can actually view references, view documents, all embedded in Reviewer side by side. They can jump back over to the form, they can log their notes, log their feedback, etc. So making it really simple because again, they oftentimes are volunteers. So it's not just giving them access to a tool like Reviewer to access the information. It's kind of that full circle access to logging results. And that's kind of the last item here. So when it comes to the evaluation side of things at Reviewer, we always feel that less is more. It's sometimes easy to kind of overanalyze and overcomplicate. With that said, we do prefer everything starts with a scorecard. Again, it all comes back to some type of compliance. While the math and the scoring may not always tell the whole story, at least kind of help move people in the right direction. So what a lot of our clients will do is they'll have, and this example is pretty robust. This one has like question, score, comment, question, score, comment. What a lot of our clients will do is they'll come in here, they'll start to fill out the score sheet. It's going to auto tabulate. Again, from a compliance perspective, it reduces potential human error. So you guys don't have to worry about crunching numbers and potentially kind of adding up formulas wrong. Reviewer will tabulate things automatically for you. But you log the scores, they can log their notes, and then boom, when they're ready, they can just press submit and they're on to the next. Again, not always does the score tell the whole story. We like to use scores because it kind of helps lock in something. So a lot of our clients will do is they'll come in here and they'll use Reviewer as a hybrid tool. They'll log scores, log notes, log comments, and then I'm going to kind of jump out real fast and come back in. But then what happens is that the team, bear with me here while I type in my password. Can't talk and do both at the same time, apparently. What's going to happen is that once the results come in, we actually have an interface that's intended to be used to spur discussions. So your team can actually do a Zoom screen share. You can filter by the different award categories or the scholarship types or the different grants. And then it shows you a listing then of all of the applicants who are in that category. I'm trying to find a better example here. All of the applicants, it shows you the entire committee. It shows each of their individual scores, and it shows all of the total scores and averages. So again, scores may tell the whole story, but this does tell you from high to low how the results came in. So what often happens is that, the committee will do a Zoom and say, okay, today we're going to look at George, who is our #1 ranked applicant. With that said, Barbara gave it a score of a 32, but Mark gave it a score of a 94. That's a real big discrepancy. So to kind of power the discussion, you can then click view, and it brings you right to George's profile. You can jump to the attachments. I can go right into Mark's scorecard and see how he scored. The two of them can deliberate. And maybe it turns out that the scores weren't the whole reflective total and that George isn't going to get a scholarship. So because the system says that he's the highest ranked, it doesn't necessarily award him the results. So you guys can kind of manipulate data from there. So I want to pause. I know we kind of ran right up to that 2:30 central mark for any kind of questions or comments. I want to make sure that I cover any of your own unique workflows or processes and how that might both translate to reviewer or just overall industry best practices or things that we're seeing in this space that might be relevant. I am going to go ahead and keep people muted just because there's about 15 people on the call. So if you want to throw them in the chat bot, that'd be great. And on that note too, kind of if you're typing things in or leaving notes while you're doing that, if there's other topics that you guys want to see us cover of either how it might work within reviewer or kind of what we're seeing in this space for future webinars, please do let us know. Not a whole lot. Give it a couple more minutes. Again, I will send out this recording. What I typically will do in this case, so yeah, confusing how to blind the names of applicants. So it depends on where you're blinding the data from, Patty. So a lot of times our team will help you because it's a very, very sticky topic. We want to make sure that if you want to blind the name of somebody, that it gets caught in every single spot that it could possibly show up. We'd hate to have you think that you blinded something. For example, if you were to blind George's name from the form, but then there's an entire section in the judging portal that says person's name that got missed. So all you have to do, it's actually quite simple, nothing to be confused about. You just tell us what you want hidden from the judges and we'll make sure it gets hidden for you. Good question. Again, while more questions might be coming in, when I send out the recording to this, I'll also include a bunch of other video resources and help guides when it comes to like using reviewer for judging. So everything from like the judging portal to assigning groups and divisions to tracking progress of the judges, things like that. Other questions or comments or things that we can run through today? And if not, I will kind of give you guys your afternoon back. Probably not today, but sometime either tomorrow or early next week, I'll follow up with the link to this. Cool. Looks like that might be it. Well, I really appreciate everybody who attended today. And again, as always, if there's any questions or comments or things I can do for you, it doesn't even have to be related to reviewer or how our platform might work. Just wanting to kind of talk through your processes, your workflows, please do let us know. We've seen quite a bit. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.